Hello, my name is Jerry Jesvold, and I'm Manager of Employer Services at Serenity Lane. Today I'm going to be presenting a presentation on the effects and consequences of alcohol and other drugs. This training is designed to present to commercially licensed drivers who are required to take a 2-hour presentation on the effects and consequences of alcohol and drugs, not to motivate people to seek treatment, but to get more education in terms of the damage that alcohol and drugs can do. So with that having been said, I'll start by covering some of the brief history of how this program got started. In the early 80s or mid 80s, there was the Department of Transportation went out and was planning on setting up a program that included training. They actually went out to different sites around the United States, 5 different sites actually. 100 truck drivers at random. They tested those drivers, and the 2 requirements were there was no punitive action and it was all done anonymously. What the results of that fact-finding was that over 42% of the truck drivers tested positive. So as a result of that, there was a need to set up both an education and training program as well as a drug testing, random drug testing for commercially licensed drivers. What it requires is that all DOT drivers are required to take a 2-hour training on the effects and consequences, which is what this training is about. And secondly, supervisors and dispatchers were required to take a 2-hour reasonable suspicion training to identify people that might be under the influence of alcohol or drugs or at risk while on the job. And then the other requirement is that all employees are required to be submitted to a random drug testing program. If we take a look at the illicit drug production in the United States, it's somewhere between $300 and $500 billion a year. And 60% of those drugs are consumed in the United States. If we take a look at marijuana, marijuana is the #1 cash crop in the United States. It's estimated that somewhere around 80,000 pounds a day is consumed. So it's a popular drug, and even more so now with the legalization both of medical and recreational marijuana in several states. In Forbes' article in 2010, November, 5 America's hardest drugs were said to be alcohol, drugs, tobacco, eating disorders, and gambling. That figure each year is $580 billion, year after year after year. The cost of alcohol and drugs in 2016 in America was $160 billion to society, 600,000 emergency room visits, 36% of new HIV cases, over 40% of workplace fatalities, $110 billion in lost productivity, over 100,000 deaths a year due to prescription drugs, 75,000 deaths a year due to alcohol alone. Alcohol is a very tissue toxic substance. Probably the only other drug that has the same toxicity is methamphetamine. Oregon employers, in 2010, there was a study done, and over 60% of the Oregon employers viewed alcohol and drug issues in the workplace as being a serious issue. In fact, in my 38 years of doing this work, the typical ways that it becomes an issue in a workplace is after some kind of a critical incident, and they realize that somebody was impaired due to drugs or alcohol. Everybody has a natural desire to alter their state of consciousness. The best example I can give is if you take a small child to a playground for the first time and you put them on a merry-go-round and spin them around and they get dizzy, they kind of giggle and laugh, and then they want to do it again. That's kind of what that is satisfying, is that desire to alter. And then when they get into junior high school or high school, they find out that they can try a drug and get an altered state of consciousness very quickly and very easily. The DSM-5 is the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual for diagnosing mental health disorders as well as substance use disorders. And that last came out in 2016, the 5th edition. And what they did is they changed the words abuse and addiction to substance use disorder, either mild, moderate, or severe, trying to take some of the stigma away from the actual diagnosis. It's easier to accept a diagnosis of a substance use disorder, an alcohol use disorder, than it is to be called an alcoholic. When an individual, there's 11 qualifiers that determine what level of a problem you have, number one, or if you have a problem, and then the level of problem that you have. If you qualify for 3 to 4 of those qualifiers, you have a diagnosis, but they would consider that to be a mild diagnosis. If you have somewhere between 4 and 5, that would be a moderate diagnosis. Anything over 6 and above would be diagnosed as a severe substance use disorder. And those disorder diagnoses are determined by specific drug. Cocaine use disorder, alcohol use disorder. We do have now, because people ask me all the time, is marijuana addicting? Well, in the DSM-5, there's a diagnosis for a marijuana use disorder. So yes, it is. Why do people develop substance use disorders? They're curious, they're peer influence, or possibly just to escape. For those of us that develop severe substance use disorders, we're typically using because it feels good or we're self-medicating. Those are the two things that are the predominant developers of people that develop severe substance use disorders. So why do employers implement drug-free workplace programs? Number one, it's legislated. Like the Department of Transportation, if you have commercially licensed drivers or you're regulated by the DOT, you're required under federal regulations to have a drug-free workplace program. Insurance incentives. The insurance companies in the late 80s, early 90s, because of the drop in recordable lost time injury accidents that they were seeing with companies that had drug-free workplace programs, they didn't come in and say you have to have a program. They just said, here's your premium with the program, here's your premium without. And that was when we got very busy across the United States helping employers develop drug-free workplace programs. And then unfortunately some kind of a workplace crisis. And that is still kind of a motivating or driving force. Once something happens and they do the investigation and find out it's due to somebody being under the influence or impaired due to drugs or alcohol, then they want to go back and try to fix things. And by that time it's too late. And I've had companies that have gone out of business because they didn't adhere to or manage the risk that they had. Something happened and there were other employees that were testifying to the attorney representing the injured party that you had prior knowledge. So it's called negligent retention. So primary effects of mood-altering psychoactive substances, drugs are either swallowed, injected, smoked, snorted. Once they get into the bloodstream and carried to the brain, they either stimulate the action of the central nervous system, slow down the action of the central nervous system, or distort perception of time and space and distances and moving objects and speeds of moving objects. Stimulants, basically caffeine, amphetamines, methamphetamines, cocaine, MDMA, also known as ecstasy. Depressants are going to be things like alcohol, opiates and pain medication, which is a severe problem in our country today. We have the federal government putting in a lot of programs to try to adhere to or to address the opiate pain medication problem. In fact, we recently had a number of doctors that were arrested because they were over-prescribing and somewhat abusing their prescribing privileges. Methadone, that's a drug that's been used recently for pain management, and my advice to people is if that's recommended, to not do it. It's a very addicting substance. We've used it in the last 25, 30 years as an opiate replacement, taking heroin addicts off the streets and putting them on a methadone maintenance program. What a heroin addict will tell you is that it's harder to get off of methadone than it is heroin. So if a doctor is prescribing methadone or suggesting methadone for pain management, you might want to reconsider it by thinking that what he's really asking you to do is take a drug that's more addicting than heroin. And I don't think you're going to want to do that. And then other sedative prescription drugs. And then the hallucinogenic drugs are going to be things like LSD, peyote, mescaline, marijuana, MDMA, MDA, and the frogs. The frogs, years ago, somebody picked up a frog in the southeast desert. They secrete, when a predator is approaching that frog and is going to pick it up and eat it, it secretes a sticky, toxic substance in the back of the neck, and the predator will spit it back out rather than eat it because it's foul tasting. Somebody 5-10 years ago picked that frog up, licked it, and it acted as a very powerful hallucinogenic drug. So then the word gets out and everybody's chasing these frogs down. And what I try to point out is the issue is not the drugs. The issue is us and being stupid enough to lick a frog to find out what happens. So people don't become instantly addicted. There's side effects that we need to be worried about or concerned about. If there were no side effects, there wouldn't be a concern about the substances in the workplace or elsewhere. So things like paranoia, anxiety, depression, drug-induced psychosis, antisocial behavior. I like to use as an example an advertisement or a commercial on a prescription drug. 5 seconds of a 30-second commercial will tell you what the drug is. The next 25 seconds will tell you the disclaimers and the side effects. And you'll hear words like fatal, psychiatric disorders, suicidal ideations, and other serious side effects or consequences. People don't become instantly addicted. There's a 4-stage process. The first one is experimentation. I don't know what the drug's going to do inside of my body until I use it. If I experience it as being pleasant, I then move on to a use stage relationship that's seeking the primary effects. I know what it's going to do. I know what to expect as long as there's consistency in the drugs. Then it becomes an abusive or potentially a substance use disorder moderate, developing a harmful dependence where the body becomes dependent on it. And then, of course, the substance use disorder severe is when the person's using the drug to avoid the withdrawal symptoms. So here we have somebody taking a drug because they like the effects of it. They keep taking it down here because they want to avoid the discomfort that they have to go through once they stop using it. The disorder moderate, you're going to have tolerance. That's going to develop where there's some level of discomfort when you take it away. There's only 2 things that'll fix that, time or the drug. And people that have substance use disorder tend to be very impatient in their decision making, so they keep using it. The second thing is adverse consequences. I'll oftentimes ask my audience, how many of you have not known someone with a substance use disorder? And there's very rarely somebody that has not known somebody. And so I also ask them, have they experienced these kinds of side effects? Adverse consequences, relationship issues, financial, legal consequences. Their personal health will deteriorate. You don't see 50-year-old meth addicts. Typically, they're either off the drug or dead, one of the two. And then also some kind of a work-related. And the interesting thing of those 5 consequences, work is probably the last one that's adversely affected. And the reason being that it feeds my denial that I don't have a problem. Over 75% of the people that are currently suffering from an active substance use disorder are employed. They're not unemployed. So they bring those risks with them to work. So the substance use disorder severe, that's when the person is, the drug and alcohol issue has become chronic. It's unpredictable. There's a loss of control. Another way of describing it is there's continued use of the substance in spite of adverse consequences. Those 5 things that I just mentioned will continue happening, and the person with the disorder will not see the consequences as being a result of the abuse of the drug or the alcohol. 4 characteristics over the years that I've come up with that relate to substance use disorders. You can't return to controlled use. We see people try that, all the time. We have 65, 70 patients in treatment right now in this facility. And some of those people are people that are coming back for a second or third episode of treatment simply because they didn't believe that there would be continued loss of control. Change is always precipitated by a crisis. We call it the precipitating event. And people will again sometimes come in and say, well, I just decided I want to change. The reality is something is pushing them through the door. They either had a consequence of a breakup of a relationship, they've lost a job, they have the potential of being incarcerated. There's something that's motivating them to see the problem differently than they have in the past. It's always diagnosed and treated by the patient. Dr. Tom Kearns, who founded Serenity Lane, he said it's the only medical condition known to modern medicine that's diagnosed by the patient and treated by the patient. We use those DSM-5 diagnosis criteria for making a legal diagnosis for insurance purposes, but unless that person can believe in the accuracy of that diagnosis and then more importantly do something to take care of it, it's probably going to be continued. And then it's always supported by what we call aiders and abettors, what I call aiders and abettors. You hear the term codependent, and there's only 2 things that can happen when people stop supporting the substance abuser. Change will precipitate a crisis that motivates them to diagnose it and treat it, or they'll go find somebody else to take your place. So they'll move on to another aider and abettor. Recent trends in America, prescription drug abuse. One of the drugs most recently, it's been about a year and a half ago now, is a drug called Zohydro. The FDA was advised not to approve that drug for prescribing. It's 5 to 10 times stronger than OxyContin. So it's a very addicting drug. 11 of the 13 panel members that advised the FDA indicated that they thought it would be unwise to approve that drug, but the FDA approved it anyway. And then America's acceptance of marijuana as another social intoxicant. What does that mean? It's certainly changing the course of the things that are going on in America in terms of complacency and those kinds of things that we see as side effects. Current trends in the workplace, alcohol abuse both on and off the job. Some people have to have a driver's license to perform the essential duties of their job. If they happen to lose that license, they don't come in and voluntarily admit that they lost it. We've had cases where people have tried to continue to drive without a license, and in some cases it's resulted in a crisis. Prescription drugs, as was mentioned, OxyContin and oxycodone. We have a pretty high percentage of young kids that try it and like it, go to the streets to buy the prescription pills. They're very expensive, so they turn to heroin, which is cheaper, and they don't inject it, they smoke it. And from smoking it, they get very addicted. I already mentioned Zohydro, methadone for pain management, other anti-anxiety medications, medical marijuana and recreational marijuana. Both of those are legal in the state of Oregon and several other states. In fact, there's 10 states that are legal, that marijuana is legal in recreationally. There's 33 states that marijuana is legal medically. And then methamphetamine is another issue. The prescription drugs, in 2007, over 2 million people reported the non-medical use of pain relievers. And there again, that plugs into the opiate crisis. There's another 1.2 million people that admit the non-medical use of tranquilizers. There's an estimated 100,000 deaths a year due to medication errors. That's the wrong medication being given to somebody in an institution. There's an additional 100,000 deaths a year due to people having an allergic reaction to a medication they've never taken. That's one of the reasons when you go to a pharmacy and pick up a new medication, one of the first questions they ask you is, have you ever taken this medication before? The other thing they're interested in knowing is, are you on any other kind of medication? Because the synergistic effect of two drugs can be fatal. And that's fatal to over 200,000 people a year. So we stress the illicit drugs, but we don't spend much time talking about those. And then the non-medical use of prescription drugs in America is higher than the abuse of cocaine, heroin, and hallucinogenic drugs combined. Problem continued. Estimated 10% of Americans are taking an antidepressant. Recent drug bust on the East Coast confiscated opiates to cause over 2 million overdose deaths. There was also a park in one of the East Coast cities where there were 30 overdose deaths in one night. They got some hard opiates. And it's estimated that 25% of Americans employed today are either on a prescribed drug or an over-the-counter medication. How does Oregon compare? 17%, almost 1 in 5 of people that are entering an emergency room are drug seeking. They're not there because something's wrong with them. They're there to get a prescription drug. And most of the time they'll walk out with a prescribed drug. Oregon's number 1 in the overdose deaths due to methadone. Naloxone is a drug that is injected to take away the possibility of an overdose deaths. All EMTs, all law enforcement officers, they all carry naloxone for that very purpose because they come across people that are overdosing, and in order to save their life, they have to be injected with naloxone, just like you would with a bee sting. And Oregon's number 1 in the non-medical use of prescription drugs by 13 to 18-year-olds. I try to warn people that be careful of what's in your medicine cabinet and keeping track of the quantity that's there so that it doesn't disappear. There's what's called Skittles Parties. This is where adolescents will take prescription opiates out of their parents' medicine cabinet. They'll go to a party and they'll dump them in a bowl. They'll start taking them at random and washing them down with alcohol, and as they put it, just to see what happens. It potentially is it has a high potential for being fatal. And then Oregon was recently stated as being number 3 in the nation in the abuse of illicit drugs. Why is there a problem? Trusting the physicians that are prescribing. I'll have a slide on it in a minute, but there's a state-run program out of the Board of Pharmacy that tracks all prescribed opiate drugs and controlled substances. And there's been several cases where the FDA has shown, or the DEA rather, has shown up on the doorstep of a physician to find out where all the prescribed opiates are going. And if they can't show that on their records, they have to surrender their DEA license to prescribe on the spot. And that has been a very effective program in terms of picking up people that are doctor shopping and doctors that are overprescribing. We've had several doctors here because of that. Ease with which prescription drugs can be obtained. The internet, there are hundreds of internet sites where you can go and obtain prescription opiates and other drugs without a prescription. Those are offshore, but it's an easy thing to do. The marketing and advertising by the drug companies. There are people that will go in and ask for a drug by drug name now because it's so well advertised. Prescription drugs are thought to be cleaner than street drugs, which they are. And then Dr. Feelgoods are the other reason. Here's the automatic tracking system. We were the 49th state to develop this program. Again, it's effective. We had a situation here with a nurse that had some pain issues down in Medford. She had obtained a prescription opiate drug there. She moved to Eugene. She had to get a new doctor, and she went to that doctor to get a prescription opiate drug, and that popped up on this automated tracking system, and they referred that to the Board of Nursing, and then she was referred to us to have an assessment. As it turned out, she did not have a diagnosis, but that's how sensitive that program is in terms of picking up people that might look like they're traveling around the state and getting the same drug in several places. As a word of caution that I've pointed out is that when you're taking an opiate drug, be sure to pay attention to what the drug's doing to you, not just what it's doing for you. I think we get so focused on the fact that it's relieving the pain, we don't know what it's pain, we don't know what it's doing to us until we don't have the drug. And then the discomfort becomes in spades. Methamphetamine is a very powerful stimulant drug. It's one that's been popular in this country for a number of years. It comes and goes. One of the things that a number of states that have had methamphetamine problems have done is they've legislated the restriction of pseudoephedrine, which is a cold medication. You need a prescription to get it now, whereas before you could just buy it off the shelf. Methamphetamine producers were buying the pseudoephedrine and extracting it and making methamphetamine. That's not happening as much now. Methamphetamine, some of the symptoms are rapid weight loss, paranoia. The reason for that is methamphetamine depletes the brain of dopamine. One of the things they know of people that are diagnosed naturally as being paranoid schizophrenic is their body doesn't produce enough dopamine. What this drug does is it depletes the brain of dopamine, and therefore they take on symptoms that would be very similar to paranoid schizophrenia, only it's drug-induced. Difficulty staying focused, significant mood changes. It's not uncommon to compare somebody that has a methamphetamine problem with somebody that's bipolar. You're either scraping them off the ceiling or scraping them off the floor. They're a wide range of emotions. They get real depressed or real anxious, loss of their teeth and their hair. Once this has happened, you're talking about a lot of the damage that's already been done on the inside. Back in the 80s, there was a meth problem down in San Francisco in the Haight-Ashbury area. There were 22, 23-year-olds that were dying due to natural causes. When they did autopsies on them, they found that their vital organs were that of a 75, 80-year-old. They were dying of old age at 22. So what they coined a phrase back then was speed kills, and it does. Like I mentioned earlier, you don't see 50-year-old meth addicts. They're either off the drug or dead, typically. And then open sores on the skin, it's again a very late stage symptom. Forms of meth, it's either crystallized or powder, tablets, rock, also known as ice, which is smoked, very intense high. Ranges in color from white to yellow or reddish brown. Methamphetamine can be taken orally, it can be injected, it can be snorted, it can be smoked. The high from meth can last for a few hours. The side effects can last a lifetime. I have a physician friend of mine in the Albany area that has a son that was doing a lot of ecstasy, and he ended up in the state hospital, and that was 5 years ago, and he's still there. So, dangerous drug. Effects of methamphetamine, extremely powerful drug. Again, it depletes the body of dopamine. It depletes the brain of dopamine, which is very pleasurable. We can measure the dopamine pleasure index. So if we talk about somebody that's eating a pleasurable meal, that will register around 150. Somebody that's had a Demerol or morphine shot That's going to be somewhere around 300. Cocaine is 300. Methamphetamine is over 1,000, 1,050. That's what makes that drug so powerful. Behavioral changes are very dramatic. Long-term abuse can lead to permanent brain damage. Abuse can lead to drug-induced paranoia, psychotic behavior, which makes it a very dangerous drug. People become aggressive. Short-term effects, increased attention and decreased fatigue. That's something that Americans would like, so they can stay up longer and party harder. That's one of the things that people relate to this drug. They're able to drink more and party longer. Increased activity and wakefulness, decreased appetite. Women tend to like this drug because it allows them to go on a diet and not miss eating. Increased respiration and blood pressure, rapid irregular heartbeat, hyperthermia, that's where the body temperature goes up, because one of the other things that the drug does to the brain is it shuts down the thermostatic part of the brain, so that when you heat up, typically you'll perspire to cool off. What this drug does is it causes the core body temperature to build up. There was a fatality of a young man, 18 years old, that died from overingestion of ecstasy. He expired, he died. 4 hours after his death, his core body temperature was still 106. So dangerous. Long-term effects, again, psychosis, organic changes in the brain structure, memory loss, aggressive violent behavior. People don't sleep when they're on this drug, so therefore they get fatigued, and that fatigue leads to aggressive violent behavior, unpredictable mood disturbances, severe dental problems. Dentists call it meth mouth. They can tell when somebody's doing a lot of meth because of the rotting of the teeth. Weight loss to the point of becoming emaciated or malnourished. We've posted on the internet, as part of our system years ago, a series of pictures of people that are involved with meth. I'm remembering one that's got about 10 photos in it, in which the first picture, the gal, she's not a 10 as far as being beautiful, but she's rather attractive. The 10th photo of her is in her casket. She's dead, and her face is just emaciated. She's basically just skin and bones. And that did have an effect on a lot of younger people in terms of the drug. So marijuana. This is an interesting drug today because of its being legal in numerous states, both medically and recreationally. It's the difference between the schedules. A Schedule I drug, which marijuana fits into federally, is a drug that there's no known medical use. The U.S. Supreme ruled on that about 5 years ago. That's one of the reasons why the drug has not been researched that much, because it's a Schedule I drug, the federal government has not allowed there to be research. That has since changed about a year ago with the FDA coming out and saying, because the federal government, the federal legislatures wanted to change it from a Schedule I to a Schedule II, because the Schedule II drug is one that's recognized to have medical benefits, but also potential for abuse or dependence. And that's been the argument, because there are some recognized medical uses for the CBDs and even marijuana to a certain extent for certain medical conditions. So there have been federal legislators that have been arguing, why do we have this drug as a Schedule II drug, or a Schedule I drug? Well, why don't we make it a Schedule II drug? And that was when the FDA came out and said, we're not going to change it from a Schedule I to a Schedule II drug, but we are going to lift restrictions for research in this country. So in the next 5-10 years, we're going to learn a lot more about this drug. And I'm sure some of it's going to be good and some of it's going to be not so good. Here's the differences. The CBDs, they're also known or referred to as cannabidiols. Those are used in treating seizure disorders and pain. In fact, the NFL has even considered changing from using opiates because of the problem that brings to people that are using the opiates to CBDs in terms of the treating of the pain. You'll go into any drugstore today, you can see they'll sell CBD products, and other retail outlets will also sell them. What's leading the government to try to consider changing it, but they've already made that decision to not do it. History in Oregon, basically in the 70s, Oregon decriminalized marijuana, making possession of less than an ounce a misdemeanor. You were issued a citation, it was basically a $100 fine, and that was it. We were one of the few states that did that back then. And then in 1998, we became the second state that legalized medical marijuana for qualifying medical conditions. That has been a very popular program. It created some problems early on because people would test in the workplace positive for THC, and they would pull out their medical marijuana card and say, oh, by the way, this is why I tested positive. And then when marijuana was legalized recreationally, that creates even more problems, because now there's a legitimate reason and a legal reason that the metabolite THC could be in the urine. And does that mean that they should be terminated? And employers are having a struggle with that today. If you're covered under the DOT, there's no exception. It's covered under federal law, and it's still a Schedule I drug under federal law. Then in 2010, interestingly, the Board of Pharmacy was ordered by the legislature to expand the possibility of changing it from a Schedule I to a Schedule II drug in the state. I was asked to go up and give testimony to not doing that. I asked when the hearing was, and they said on a Friday afternoon at 1 o'clock. So I got there at about 12:15, and the Board of Pharmacy knows who I am, and I walked up to the reception, and the gal said, "Hi, Jerry, how you doing? What are you here for?" And I said, "I'm here to testify at the hearing at 1 o'clock. She said, "Well, we changed that. We had it at 11. It's already been held." So that was not a very pleasant response on my part, as you might expect. And they did change it. Oregon is the only state in the nation that I'm aware of that has marijuana as a Schedule II drug. And then in 2014, Measure 91 passed, and that was where the voters, made marijuana legal for recreational purposes. I was called by no less than 5 or 6 radio stations around the state the day after Measure 190 passed, and each one of the interviewers asked me, do you think it's true that what they've been telling us, that now that marijuana is legal, there won't be a black market for marijuana? And pardon me for putting it this way, but we have a clinical term for that. The term is bullshit. There will definitely be a black market. And I think that's one of the things today, 4 or 5 years later, that has proven to be true. They're having a hard time in Oregon marketing all the marijuana that they're growing. They've got like a 5-year supply in the state of Oregon from legally grown marijuana. They've talked about wanting to legislate the transportation of the drug to states like Colorado that also have legalized marijuana for the purpose of extracting CBDs. But like the Attorney General pointed out, it's illegal to transport it over state lines. And then in October, medical marijuana dispensaries began selling marijuana for recreational purposes. And then in June of 2016, edibles were available, and they present a particularly interesting challenge because they're packaged. You got gummy bears that look just like gummy bears. The big problem in Colorado, and it's happened some here, is that you get children that see a packaged candy like gummy bears, and they eat them, and they overdose. And they have to take them to the emergency room. So it's a serious problem. Plus, we've also had some cases here where people have admitted that have been using in the workplace and gotten kind of scared because they got kind of high. Examples of acceptance of marijuana in society: we have 8th and 11th graders that are more likely to smoke marijuana than they are tobacco. That's kind of a good news, bad news. They smoke the marijuana because it gets them high. And we have medical card holders as young as 12 years old with parental permission. Medical versus recreational: basically you have to have a qualifying medical condition to get a medical marijuana card. If you, on the recreationally, the use of marijuana, you have to be 21, just like alcohol. And then I already mentioned about the black market. The Oregon medical marijuana law, once a physician authorizes that you have a qualifying medical condition, you apply for and receive a medical marijuana card. Once you get that card, you can possess 6 mature plants, 18 seedlings, and 1.5 pounds, 24 ounces of dry marijuana with no penalty. That's a lot of marijuana, especially the quality of the marijuana today. The first year only yielded about 100 cards. In 2014, we had over 80,000 medical marijuana cards. And somewhat that's slowing down now because of the recreational dispensaries. Somebody that's using it medically can go to a recreational marijuana dispensary and buy it. The discouragement of doing that is because it's more expensive. It's taxed at a higher rate in recreational facilities. Number of physicians, there's a lot of them. The Oregon Supreme Court did rule that employers do not have to accommodate the medical use of marijuana. So that was a good decision. They say they're not going to violate the federal law. And then Oregon is the only state that has declassified it into a Schedule II drug. Faults with the Oregon medical marijuana program: there's no dosing recommendations. If you've got 1.5 pounds of dried marijuana, you can medicate quite a bit over time. The amounts of marijuana that can be possessed: 95% of the cards are issued for severe pain. Very hard to qualify or to determine, so it becomes an arguable reason to have it. There's no requirement for the cardholder to be evaluated by a qualified person as to whether or not they have a DSM-5 diagnosis for a marijuana use disorder. And I would say a certain percentage of those 80,000 cards that are issued they don't have medical issues. They're just doing it to be legal. There's an advisory board that the Oregon Medical Marijuana Program has. The qualifying condition to be on that medical marijuana advisory board is to have a medical marijuana card. So that's not exactly what I'd call consistent. And then Oregon voters would probably not approve the Oregon Medical Marijuana Program as it exists today. However, the majority of people are in favor of legalization. So it's kind of a conflicting message. Over the past 6 years, we have 29 states, actually there's 33 now, that have medical marijuana legalization, and there are 10 states that have recreational use legalization. There are currently 12 more states that are looking at legalizing marijuana in 2019. Vermont was the first state to not go to the voters and ask them if they want it. They just legislated it. And here's the reason why. The state of Colorado in 2018 took in over $1.5 billion in revenue. That equated out to about $500 or $600 million in taxes. This year it's going to be higher. In Oregon, the first week there was over $11 million in sales. In the first 2 months they took in more tax revenue than they estimated they were going to in the full 12 months. So it's a money cow. And that's why there's more and more states now that are looking at it, just kind of like video poker, where you can get money to help fill the budget holes. They're going to look at that and do that. In Oregon, 18-year-old use of marijuana shot up from 13% in 2013 to 20% in 2015. That's just at the consistency of the legalization of marijuana. We introduced legislation to sell the excessive marijuana in other states, but again, it was overruled because it's not legal to transport it. But that was one of the things they were looking at for generating more revenue. Here are the problems with marijuana. THC is fat soluble. That means it attaches to fatty tissue in the body. That's why it will show up in a urine screen sometimes weeks longer than the actual consumption of the drug, which equates to non-defining of whether the person's impaired or not. And that's the big issue. Brain is the single fattiest tissue. We had one case down at a plywood plant, Southern Oregon, where a young 22-year-old gal was cleaning out a plywood press. She forgot to lock out, tag out. The press compressed and crushed her to death. And when they did the autopsy, what they found in her blood was THC. And those are the typical things that will happen. There's just kind of a forgetfulness, a tendency to just leave some things out. Heavy use can lead to thinking errors and difficulty learning. Changes are a lot more subtle, and people don't tend to be aggressive. They tend to be more complacent. Some people can become apathetic. We refer to that as the Amotivational Syndrome. Some of the advocates for marijuana legalization will say that's a fake. It doesn't happen. It does happen. I experienced it myself, and I know I've talked to other patients that have. Reasons to be concerned: the THC levels in the marijuana today. Some of the butane honey oils can be as high as 90% THC. It's where they extract it and make it into a liquid. It's the old hash oil. So we don't have the scientific clarity when somebody is currently impaired. Again, that's something that hopefully will develop over the next 5 years. The adverse effect that it's going to have on adolescent brains. The brain develops till age 25. So if you got 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old kids that are doing the vaping, in fact, you've heard in the news in the last 2 months that vaping amongst teenagers is up like 300%. And they're thinking that they're vaping tobacco products. I guarantee you some of them are vaping marijuana. And the reason it also makes it popular amongst adolescents is that vaping is odorless. So it's not like you're smoking weed where you can smell that pungent odor. It's completely odorless. Colorado's experienced adolescent use increased. We're seeing the same thing. Emergency room admissions were higher, mostly because of ODs due to edibles. Edibles, unfortunately, when you eat them, you have to digest them before they get to the brain, before the THC gets to the brain. When that happens, people think when they eat something and they don't get high that they need to eat more. So they keep doing that, and subsequently the overdose hits all at once. And then traffic fatalities and THC DUIs have increased Washington State also did a study. Marijuana versus alcohol. Currently, there's no way of measuring how much THC there is in the blood without taking the blood. Again, in Washington State, their law is if you've got 5 nanograms of THC in your blood and you're stopped for cause, and they take you into a hospital and draw blood and you have 5 nanograms in your blood, they will issue a DUI charge, driving under the influence of marijuana. In Oregon, we don't have that kind of a law, so they don't draw. They have to try and determine whether the person's impaired at the time of the selection of the urine. They can request a urine sample, but just because there's THC in the urine doesn't mean that they were impaired at the time that the urine screen was taken. So it creates a lot of conflict legally. In fact, I'm on the Lane County Victim Impact Panel around DUI legislation. And they're called DREs, drug recognition experts. They're law enforcement officers that have been taught how to identify somebody under the influence of something other than alcohol. So I asked them in our last meeting, I said, are you guys issuing some citations for driving under the influence of marijuana? They said they were. The district attorney was also in the room, and I asked her, I said, so how's it going? She said, we're losing more cases than we're winning. It's because we can't establish that the person was impaired at the time the drug test was done. Impairment is determined by the amount of substance in the blood. Therefore, until we have a breathalyzer or some other type, I thought when in 2012, when Colorado legalized recreational marijuana, that somebody would come up with a breathalyzer. And it took me about 1.5 years or 2 years, as they were not establishing a breathalyzer for THC, that alcohol is water soluble, therefore it's going to vaporize. So it'll be in the breath. THC is fat soluble, so it's not going to vaporize. So it's not going to show up. And that's why we haven't been able to develop one. I think they'll come up with something later on. The issue becomes once a person tests positive for THC, and all of the judges, and there have been dozens of cases, where judges have ruled that just because there's THC in the urine does not mean that the person was impaired. So those are usually, in all cases that I'm aware of, they've been thrown out. Anything that has gone to one of the state's Supreme Court, the ultimate final decision has been that the employer prevailed, except for one that I'll tell you about in a minute. So it's a confusing issue. A lot of employers have decided, you know what, we're just not going to test for it anymore, unless we see that somebody's impaired. And again, that's sometimes hard to prove. That's the Lane County case in 2016. They terminated a guy. He was on a medical marijuana card, which again, the Oregon Supreme Court has said you don't have to accommodate the medical use of marijuana. So Lane County had in their policy based on that. They have a zero tolerance, and therefore, if you test positive for marijuana, you will be terminated. They also said as a reason why is because they received federal funds, and it's illegal federally. So if they're allowing somebody to use marijuana, which is against federal law, they run the risk of losing those federal funds. So that was their grounds for termination. The AFSCME union filed a grievance, and in the middle of 2017, the guy got his job back, $23,000 in back pay, and then also $8,000 in attorney's fees. The other thing that has happened is a study that was done in Johns Hopkins University Medical School. We have always said in the past, when somebody says they've never used marijuana when they test positive, or when they finally come down to the point where they say, well, I haven't used it, but I was in a room or in a car where somebody else was using it, so it was because of passive inhalation. We'd never had any kind of a scientific study that showed that that could happen. Couldn't exceed the 50 nanogram threshold. There were two things that the Johns Hopkins University Medical School found out. One is that the intensity of the marijuana today will cause somebody to have a mild contact high from passive inhalation. And two, they can test positive. There were several of the participants in the study that after inhaling the passive inhalation, they did test positive. So it's not always an automatic. The issues with edibles, again, what's happening, and it happened here in Eugene, it's been about a year ago now, but there was a block party. Some guy baked some dessert with marijuana in it, didn't disclose it. There were 4 people that went to the emergency room because they didn't know what was wrong with them. They were experiencing a marijuana high for the first time. He finally admitted, well, yeah, I did, but what's the big deal? It's legal. Well, if you happen to be in the Department of Transportation random testing policy and you go to work the following day and you test positive, conceivably you could lose your CDL for life if it was your second offense. So the issue, what I've pounded the table about when I'm on a radio station, we're talking about somebody making edibles, is that if you're going to do that, disclose it. Let people know that there is marijuana in this food. So that way people can make a decision that's consistent with what they want. The current status, if a company again is regulated by federal government like the Department of Transportation, hospitals, they receive Medicare and Medicaid payments. So their standard process or policy is to terminate somebody that tests positive for THC. We just had one at the local hospital. He's a guy that worked in the ER. He tested positive for THC. And when the hospital reports that to the Board of Nursing, which he was a nurse, the Board of Nursing will look at it and say, if he wasn't impaired on the job, there's no action that's going to be taken against his license. Because it's legal in Oregon, they're treating it just like they would any alcohol consumption or being under the influence of alcohol at work, but not impaired. Unlike the medical use of marijuana, there have been no current decisions made regarding recreational marijuana. I think we need a test case to kind of determine what the deal is. The public sentiment regarding marijuana, it's shifted from over 40% 5 years ago to the legalization of recreational marijuana is around 64% in favor of it, and over 90% are in favor of legalization of medical marijuana. So it has become a much more widely accepted drug for both medical and recreational consumption. So the DOT drug testing program, we're talking about the types of testing. They're basically pre-employment, post-accident, reasonable suspicion, random, and return to duty. So if you have a CDL, these are all the testing, types of testing that you're subjected to. There's the collection process called the chain of custody. It's a very tight chain of custody. People, when the program first went into effect in the late 80s, a lot of people were concerned and worried about whether or not there could be a false positive. There's a higher probability of having a false negative than there is to have a false positive, just because of the tightness of that process. Basically, the process includes an initial test, and then subsequently there's a GCMS, gas chromatography, or mass spectrometry. That's the gold standard. So first of all, you have to have a test positive for a particular drug here, and then it needs to confirm with the GCMS as exactly the same drug, or it's tested back or it's sent back as a negative. The use of an MRO, that's a medical review officer. It's a physician that knows a lot about drugs. And basically that person is going to determine whether there's a legitimate reason for the metabolite to be in the blood or in the body, in the urine, I should say. And then there's blind samples. It costs several $1 million to become a SAMHSA certified lab. And there's these blind samples sent in with certain drugs in them or no drugs at all. And subsequently, if that lab gets one wrong, they will have their license suspended and investigated. If they subsequently have another one wrong, they lose their license. So it's a big investment to lose. So that's how careful they are in determining that they're having it's an accurate test. Once a positive test is confirmed, the person goes to a substance abuse professional, also referred to as a SAP. That SAP will do one of those DSM-5 evaluations and determine whether or not they have a condition. And if they do, they're referred to treatment, and they must follow the requirements of that treatment, or they lose their CDL. Or if they test positive again, they lose their CDL. And they lose it for life. So it's a very serious consequence.